There is a strange moment that happens in every community when the truth finally begins to surface. It is not loud at first. It does not arrive with headlines or announcements. Instead, it begins quietly, almost uncomfortably, when people start noticing that something they once ignored no longer makes sense. For a long time, what happened to you existed in that quiet space. People saw pieces of it. They heard fragments. They noticed the tension in conversations, the subtle shifts in behavior, the unexplained distance that appeared around your name. But noticing something is not the same as confronting it, and confronting it is not the same as acknowledging that something deeply wrong has taken place. Most communities prefer peace over truth, at least in the beginning, because peace feels stable. Truth, on the other hand, tends to disturb the balance people have grown comfortable with. And when truth threatens that balance, many people look away, not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid of what seeing clearly might require from them. Yet there comes a moment when the cost of ignoring reality becomes greater than the comfort of silence. That moment is where you find yourself now. The same voices that once remained quiet are suddenly asking questions. The same people who once kept their distance are now looking closely at what happened. And the community that once appeared indifferent is beginning to feel something it did not feel before. Outrage, not the shallow outrage that appears for a day and disappears the next, but the kind of outrage that grows slowly once people begin to realize that what they accepted as normal may never have been acceptable at all. For a long time, the story surrounding you was controlled by convenience. Convenience for those who did not want to get involved. Convenience for those who benefited from keeping things exactly as they were. Convenience for a system that functioned better when difficult questions remained unasked. But convenience has a weakness. It only survives as long as no one examines it too closely. And once people begin looking carefully, once conversations begin happening behind closed doors, once patterns stop becoming visible, the entire narrative begins to change. This is why the atmosphere feels different now. Something that was once tolerated is now being examined. Something that was once dismissed is now being discussed openly. And something that once happened quietly is now demanding an answer. What was done to you? Because when people finally allow themselves to see clearly, they begin to understand something important. Harm rarely survives exposure, and once a community starts asking the right questions, silence can no longer protect what was once hidden. When people finally realized something was wrong in the beginning, most people did not recognize the seriousness of what was happening, not because there were no signs. There were signs everywhere, but signs are easy to overlook when they arrive gradually. A change in tone, a quiet exclusion, a conversation that ends abruptly when someone enters the room, small moments that feel uncomfortable but are easily explained away. Human beings are remarkably skilled at convincing themselves that what they see is not what it appears to be. We do this because the alternative, the possibility that something unfair or unjust is happening right in front of us, is difficult to accept, especially in communities built on trust, communities where people expect decency, communities where faith, values, and integrity are spoken about openly. When something harmful occurs in such places, the first instinct is often disbelief. Surely that cannot be what it looks like. There must be another explanation. I'm sure someone responsible is already handling it. These thoughts allow people to maintain a sense of order, because if the harm were real, if it were truly happening without correction, then it would raise a far more uncomfortable question. How could something unjust exist in a place that claims to value justice? For a while, those questions remained unasked. People continued their routines. Meetings continued. Conversations moved forward as though everything was functioning exactly as it should. But beneath that surface, something subtle was shifting. Some people began noticing inconsistencies. stories that did not match, explanations that felt incomplete, decisions that seemed strangely convenient for certain individuals while leaving others exposed. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the realization began to form. Something here is not right. That realization does not happen all at once. It builds, it spreads from one conversation to another. Someone mentions a concern. Another person admits they noticed something similar. Suddenly, the pieces that once felt unrelated begin forming a pattern. And once people begin seeing patterns, the illusion of normalcy begins to crack. That is the stage a community enters when awareness begins. The moment when people stop assuming everything is fine and start asking why it wasn't. Why no one spoke up earlier? One of the most painful questions that often arises after injustice becomes visible is this: why didn't anyone say something sooner? It is a question filled with frustration and sometimes even disappointment. But the answer is really simple. Silence inside communities is not always the result of indifference. More often, it grows out of hesitation. Most people are not eager to confront situations that may disrupt relationships, reputations, or long-standing dynamics, especially in environments where harmony is valued. People convince themselves that stepping forward might create unnecessary conflict. They tell themselves they may not understand the full story. They wonder whether speaking up might accidentally make things worse. These thoughts feel responsible. They feel cautious, but over time, they create something dangerous. A culture of waiting for someone else to speak first, waiting for clear evidence, waiting for the situation to resolve itself without requiring personal involvement. Unfortunately, injustice rarely corrects itself simply because people hope it will. In fact, silence often gives it room to grow. Every moment that passes without confrontation quietly communicates something to those responsible. It communicates that resistance is unlikely, that questions are minimal, that the environment is safe for the behavior to continue. And yet, from the outside, the silence appears confusing. How could so many people remain quiet? How could something harmful exist for so long without intervention? The uncomfortable truth is that most communities do not act quickly. They act once enough people feel certain that action will not isolate them. Once several voices begin speaking at once, the atmosphere changes. What once felt risky begins to feel supported, and suddenly people who once remained quiet feel safer acknowledging what they already suspected. This does not erase the pain of the delay, but it does explain why it happens. Human beings rarely move against a current alone. They wait until they see others standing in that same direction. And when that moment arrives, when enough people recognize the same reality, the silence that once protected injustice begins to dissolve. The community's reaction began to shift. There is a moment in every community when quiet observation turns into something else, concern. For a long time, their reaction surrounding what happened to you was muted. People noticed things, but they kept their thoughts mostly to themselves. Conversations happened in small circles, often behind closed doors. Questions were asked carefully, almost cautiously, as if speaking too openly might create a conflict no one was ready to face. But something began to change. The more people compared their observations, the harder it became to maintain the earlier sense of neutrality. What once felt like isolated concerns began forming a shared understanding, and when multiple people start reaching the same conclusion independently, the atmosphere within a community begins to shift. At first, the change is subtle. People who once avoided the topic begin mentioning it in conversation. Individuals who once remained completely silent begin asking quiet questions. The tone surrounding the situation grows more serious, more reflective. Then something even more important happens. Empathy begins to replace distance. When a community starts recognizing that a person has carried a burden unfairly, the emotional response changes. What once felt like someone else's issue begins to feel personal. People imagine what it must have been like to stand in your position to face misunderstanding, isolation, or unfair treatment, while others looked away. And that realization has power, because empathy awakens a sense of responsibility. For many people of faith, these moments carry spiritual weight. That teaching of Christ repeatedly emphasized the importance of recognizing the suffering of others and responding with compassion rather than indifference. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus reminds his followers that how they treat the vulnerable reveals something deeper about their own hearts. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Those words resonate strongly with believers who value integrity and accountability. When people begin reflecting on what happened to you through that lens, their situation stops being a distant story and becomes a moral question. And moral questions rarely stay quiet for long. Gradually, conversations grow more open. People who once hesitated to speak now feel compelled to express concern. The community's emotional posture begins shifting from passive observation to active awareness. This shift does not happen because people suddenly become different individuals overnight. It happens because clarity changes perspective. Once people see the situation more clearly, their conscience begins asking questions that cannot easily be ignored. Was something unfair allowed to continue? Did silence enable something that should have been challenged sooner? And most importantly, what should be done now that the truth is becoming visible? When a community reaches this stage, neutrality begins to disappear, because once empathy takes root, indifference becomes much harder to maintain. Questions started getting louder as awareness spreads within a community. Another transformation begins to take place. Questions grow louder, not necessarily in volume, but in seriousness. In the beginning, the questions surrounding what happened to you were tentative. People asked them privately, often prefaced with hesitation. They wondered if they might be misunderstanding something or if there were details they simply didn't know. But as more information surfaced and more individuals began recognizing these same patterns, the nature of those questions changed. They became clearer and more direct. Instead of asking whether something might be wrong, people began asking why it had happened at all. Instead of wondering if there was an explanation, they began asking who had allowed the situation to continue. This is the stage where a community's moral compass begins to assert itself. When enough people sense that something unjust may have occurred, the conversation inevitably shifts from curiosity to accountability. Individuals who once felt unsure about speaking began realizing that silence itself carries consequences. They began understanding that failing to ask difficult questions can allow harmful situations to persist longer than they should. For many believers, this moment is deeply connected to faith. Scripture often reminds us that truth and justice require courage. In the Old Testament, the prophets repeatedly called communities to examine their actions honestly and to speak openly when wrongdoing was present. One of the most powerful examples comes from the book of Isaiah, where the people are urged to seek justice, correct oppression. Those words are not merely spiritual ideals, they are practical instructions. Communities that value righteousness must eventually confront what is wrong, even when doing so is uncomfortable. As the questions surrounding your experience grew more visible, the atmosphere around the situation changed dramatically. What was once whispered became openly discussed. People began asking how decisions had been made. They began examining who had authority in this situation and whether that authority had been exercised responsibly. And perhaps most importantly, they began asking whether the explanations that once seemed acceptable truly reflected the full truth. These questions do not arise out of hostility. They arise from a growing sense of responsibility, because once people recognize that someone may have endured something unjust, they feel compelled to understand how it happened, and once that process begins, the conversation rarely returns to silence. Questions have a remarkable power within communities. They create transparency, they encourage reflection, and they remind everyone involved that actions, once hidden, eventually face the light of examination. The louder the questions become, the harder it becomes for incomplete explanations to survive. And as those questions continue spreading through the community, something else begins to emerge, a collective desire for clarity, not for the sake of controversy, but for the sake of truth. Those involved started feeling the pressure. There is a moment in situations like this when the atmosphere begins to change for those who were once comfortable with silence. At first, the people closest to what happened to you felt little urgency to explain themselves. The situation remained contained. Conversation stayed within familiar circles, and as long as the community remained largely unaware, there was little reason for anyone to feel pressure. But that comfort rarely lasts once awareness spreads. When questions begin circulating throughout a community, something subtle yet powerful begins to unfold. The individuals who once assumed the matter would remain quiet begin realizing that the environment around them is changing. Conversations grow more cautious, statements become carefully worded. People who once spoke confidently about the situation begin choosing their words with greater restraint. This shift is rarely dramatic. It often happens quietly, in small gestures and subtle adjustments. Someone who once dismissed the situation now avoids discussing it. Another individual who once defended certain decisions begins speaking less frequently. These changes may seem insignificant on the surface, but they reveal something important. Awareness has consequences. When a community begins asking serious questions, those connected to the original situation begin feeling the weight of scrutiny. Not necessarily hostility, but attention. And attention has a way of encouraging reflection for many people of faith. This stage carries a familiar spiritual theme throughout Scripture. There are moments when individuals who once believed their actions would remain unnoticed suddenly realize that accountability is approaching, not always through punishment, but through exposure. The Apostle Paul once wrote a simple yet powerful reminder: "Nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest." Those words reflect a principle that extends beyond theology into everyday life. Human actions often exist comfortably in darkness until light begins to shine, and when that light appears, people naturally begin examining their own choices. This is the stage the community has now reached. Those who once assumed the situation would fade into the background are recognizing that it has not disappeared. Instead, it has drawn increasing attention. The questions are now fading. If anything, they are growing clearer, and with that clarity comes an unavoidable reality. People who were once certain the silence would protect them now realize that silence itself may invite even greater scrutiny. This does not mean every individual involved acted with deliberate harm. Human situations are rarely that simple. Many people participate in events without fully understanding the consequences until much later, but understanding arrives eventually, and when it does, it often carries a heavy awareness. The awareness that decisions once made quietly are now being viewed through a different lens. The awareness that explanations once accepted without question may now require deeper reflection. And most importantly, the awareness that a community now expects something it did not demand before: honest answers. Why the truth couldn't stay hidden? There is a reason that situations like yours eventually come into the light. Truth has a persistence that deception rarely possesses. For a time, incomplete explanations can hold together. Stories can be repeated often enough that they begin to sound convincing. People can reassure themselves that what happened was either unavoidable or misunderstood. But truth has a quiet strength. It does not depend on loud voices to survive. Instead, it waits. It waits until enough people begin noticing these same inconsistencies. It waits until conversations begin overlapping, and it waits until the reality of what's occurred becomes too visible to ignore. What makes truth powerful is not its speed, but its endurance. A misleading narrative may appear strong at first, but it requires constant reinforcement. It must be repeated, defended, and protected by those who benefit from it. Truth, on the other hand, requires very little maintenance. Once people begin seeing it clearly, it speaks for itself. This is why situations that were once carefully contained often become impossible to hide over time, not because someone suddenly decides to reveal everything dramatically, but because awareness spreads gradually throughout the community. One conversation leads to another. One realization encourages someone else to reconsider what they once accepted, and before long, the understanding that once existed in small private circles becomes part of a much larger awareness. For believers, this process often reflects something deeply spiritual. Throughout the Bible, truth is described not merely as information, but as illumination. In the Gospel of John, Jesus declares, "The truth will set you free." That freedom does not always come immediately. Sometimes it arises slowly through reflection and courage. But once truth becomes visible, it changes the atmosphere around it. People begin recognizing that what was once tolerated cannot remain acceptable. They realize that silence is no longer a neutral position, and they begin acknowledging that understanding the full reality of what happened is necessary, not to create division, but to restore integrity. Integrity matters deeply within communities built on faith. It represents the commitment to align actions with values, even when doing so requires uncomfortable honesty and weight. Integrity becomes the guiding principle of a community's response. Something important happens. Their focus shifts away from protecting reputations and toward protecting truth. That shift is often what makes hidden situations impossible to maintain, because once a community chooses clarity over convenience, the space where secrecy once existed begins to disappear. And when that space disappears, the truth that once struggled to be heard finally finds its voice. Not through anger alone, but through understanding, and through the growing determination of people who believe that what was done to you deserves to be fully understood. What this moment really means: there comes a point in every story like yours when the focus begins to shift. For a long time, the attention centered on what was done to you, the confusion, the silence, the questions that seemed to hang in the air without answers. But as the community begins to reflect more deeply, something important happens. The story stops being only about the harm. It begins to reveal something much larger. It reveals character. Not only the character of those who allowed the situation to unfold, but the character of the one who endured it. Because in the end, what defines a person is not merely what happens to them, it is how they respond when faced with circumstances that test their integrity. Throughout history, people of faith have understood this truth well. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who endured seasons of misunderstanding, isolation, and injustice before the full meaning of their experiences became clear. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers and falsely accused before rising to a position where truth could finally be recognized. David spent years misunderstood and pursued before the purpose of his journey unfolded. And even Christ himself was rejected by many before the deeper truth of his mission became visible to the world. These stories remind believers of something that can be difficult to see in the middle of hardship. Moments of injustice do not always represent the end of the story. Sometimes they reveal the beginning of something greater. In your case, the outrage now spreading through the community is not simply a reaction to past events. It is a reflection of awakening. People are beginning to see what they once overlooked. They are beginning to understand what silence once concealed, and they are recognizing that integrity matters far more than convenience. For many individuals watching this situation unfold, the most striking realization is not what happened. It is the fact that you remain standing, despite the misunderstandings, despite the pressure, despite the expectation that time and fatigue might eventually force you. In the silence, you did not collapse under the weight of it, and that resilience speaks louder than any explanation ever could, because resilience reveals something powerful. It reveals that truth does not always shout. Sometimes it simply endures, and endurance has a remarkable effect on the human conscience. When people witness someone who refuses to abandon their integrity, it forces reflection. It forces others to reconsider their own actions, their own silence, and their own responsibilities within a community. That is why this moment matters, not because outrage alone changes anything, but because awareness has the potential to transform a community. A community that chooses honesty over comfort becomes stronger. A community that learns from its mistakes becomes wiser, and a community that acknowledges injustice becomes capable of protecting others from experiencing the same harm again. Your experience, painful as it may have been, has already begun creating that kind of reflection. People are asking questions they once avoided. They are examining decisions they once accepted, and they are recognizing that integrity requires more than good intentions. It requires courage. For those who share faith in God, there is also a deeper reassurance in moments like this, the belief that truth ultimately belongs to God. Human systems may delay justice, human communities may struggle to see clearly at first, but truth has a way of emerging when the time is right. Not always quickly, but inevitably. The outrage that now fills the community is not merely anger, it is recognition. Recognition that something should have been handled differently, recognition that silence can carry consequences, and recognition that integrity must guide the future. For you, the chosen one in this story, that realization carries a quiet vindication, not the loud vindication of revenge, but the deeper vindication of clarity, the clarity that comes when people finally see the situation for what it truly was. And in that clarity, something meaningful begins to grow: understanding, accountability, and perhaps most importantly, a renewed commitment within the community to ensure that truth is never again left waiting in the shadows. Because when truth is finally acknowledged, it does more than correct the past, it shapes the future.